Okay, what I'm going to talk about today is some basic cattle handling and stockmanship. Now, a real basic principle in working with any type of animal is a calm animal is easier to handle. An animal that's not scared, that's low fear. Now, some people might say that fear is not a scientific word. It is a scientific word. It's been used for years over in the neuroscience literature, because one of the problems we have in science is each discipline tends to just read their own stuff. I like going across disciplines. Okay, this horse right here, definitely getting fear, because all of a sudden the saddle fell off. And something like that really scare it. There's also an interaction with its temperament. You know, we talk about temperament testing cattle, temperament testing animals. An animal that's really high fear will have a bigger reaction when something sudden like this happens compared to an animal that's genetically a lower fear animal. Okay, what are signs that cattle and horses are starting to get scared? First thing they'll do, heads up, just alert. And then they get upset, they pin the ears back. But the big signs are when you scare the poop out of them. Tail switching in cattle and horses is when there's no flies around, that's a sign that they're starting to kind of get really upset. That's an early warning before the horse will kick or bite, or cattle might kick. And when eye white's showing, your animal's really getting scared. Sort of like a pot coming to a boil. They'll give you some warning signs before they do something violent. Okay, let's talk about how lighting and how some distractions can interfere with cattle handling, especially in a place where they don't go every day, like an auction market, meat packing plant, feed yard. You know, a lighting problem will have a much less of an effect on dairy cow because she'll get used to walking over the shadow. You don't want to be working your animals right directly into blinding sun. You might want to change the time of day that you handle them. Cattle have a tendency to move towards the light, but they're not going to go into blinding light. Get down and get a cattle's eye view of things. This is coming right up to the entrance to single file chute, and I can see a car through the fence. Vehicles parked along fences can often make animals balk. Now, an animal that's calm will look right at the thing he doesn't really like. Now, if he's all excited, he'll just turn back. But if he's calm, he'll look right at it, show you he doesn't like the chain hanging down, the coat on the fence, paper cup on the ground. You want to remove those things. There's a chain hanging down. Why, after all these years, do I still have to talk about chains hanging down in chutes? People aren't taking them out. I want to get you to be a better observer. What's your animal doing? They'll point their ears toward things. They'll point their ears in different directions. I want you to watch that. Be an observer. Now, you really want to understand cattle and horses. Get away from language. They don't think in words. Their memories are sounds, things they see. And since they're a prey species animal, they tend to get afraid of stuff that moves rapidly, things they see first. Now, this is what I call the dark movie theater effect. It's real sunny outside, and we got a dark cattle handling facility inside. So on a sunny day, they're not going to want to go in there. Now, at night, I can just light this up with lights, and it'll work perfectly at night. They don't like going into the dark. And on sunny days, they're going to go into a building a lot more easily if they can see through it. See, they put some white translucent panels in it. Or you just have it so they can see through it. So they see light at the end of the tunnel. But what's really important is it must not be blinding light, like headed straight into the sun. Now, if you're out in the field, there's a water puddle there. I can't get rid of all the water puddles. So your leader comes up there, and your leader stops. She's going to put her head down. Give her time to put her head down, take a look, and when her head comes back up, then you can drive her. If they're a little bit scared and the heads are up like that, she's not going to go. Ron Gill talks about this, and he says, head down, don't push them. Head way up like this, don't push them. Get the head neutral, and then you can push them. So you're going to have to just wait for a few seconds for that animal to look at that puddle. Then once the leader looks at it, the other cattle will follow. Just give them a few seconds to do that. Now this shows a backstop gate at the entrance to a single file. Oftentimes these make cattle balk. You might want to tie it open. Maybe hook it up with a remote control rope so you can hold it open for the cattle. But make sure it doesn't jiggle like this. They won't go in. I've seen situations where a paper towel just hanging like this stopped cattle at a meat packing plant. They weren't afraid of getting slaughtered. They were afraid of a paper towel because it was little motion. It's also something that looks like it shouldn't be there. Observation. I had a wonderful chance to go to Cape Kennedy and visit a launch pad, and I saw something that shouldn't be there. It was a raccoon waddling down the stairs. Yeah, not supposed to be there. I noticed that. Cattle notice things like that, and that can interfere with handling. Here's an important principle. When you're working in the corrals, or you're working in a feed yard handling facility, or at a meat packing plant, bringing up small groups, moving small groups of cattle and pigs. Now, the correct size of the small group is going to vary depending upon the facility. But the biggest problem I'm seeing is you might have a facility where if you bring 15 cattle up at a time, it works fine, but you bring 25 up, it's terrible. Good handling will require more walking. People have got to go back and forth and bring up those small groups. This is one of the biggest problems I see in working cattle through the squeeze chute, the meat packing plant, is people don't want to walk as much, so they'll bring all these cattle up there. Fill your crowd pen half full. Now, if I take and I jam the crowd pen that leads to the single file chock full, they're all going to turn around on me. Cattle have a natural behavior to go back to where they come from. And they're going to work much more easily in the facility if I wait until I have some space in the single file, and then I just bring them up, and they keep on walking, and they go through the system. Use your crowd pen as a passing through pen. So you're going to have to learn how to time your bunches. So that you let your single file get partially empty, then you bring up your next group and just keep them going. Don't give them time to turn around. Now, another reason for filling your crowd pen half full is so if your cattle do turn around, you've got room to turn them. Take a little flag and maybe turn your cattle. But I've been fighting with people about jamming crowd pens totally full for as long as I've been around. Good handling requires more walking. Now, animals have a flight zone. You can see how kind of a bubble forms around the people. Now, if I have completely tame show cattle, they'll have no flight zone. Sometimes they can be difficult to drive. Now, what determines the size of this bubble? If I have animals where they all have had the same handling experiences, then it's genetics. Now, handling experience is also affected. Amount of contact with people and quality of contact with people. If people have been yelling and screaming at them, you'll have a bigger flight zone. We've got to stop yelling and screaming at livestock. It stresses them out. And one of the reasons why it stresses them out is yelling and screaming has intent. Those animals know you're screaming at them. Where a gate slamming or some other machinery noise, it doesn't have intent. So get your mouth shut. And your animals with a genetically flighty temperament that have all been raised under the same conditions, their flight zone will tend to be bigger than the cattle that have a calmer temperament. Okay, people working with cattle need to understand the flight zone. If I've got cattle in a pen or on a pasture and I enter the flight zone, they move away. Now you'll also notice we've got a tan animal there that's turning and looking. There's a zone outside the flight zone. Some people call it the pressure zone, the zone of awareness, or the zone of influence. They know you're there, turn and look at you, but they're not moving away. And then the cattle that are eating, they don't even pay attention to me. Here's a very handy-dandy way to get an animal to move forward in a chute. And it's kind of counterintuitive, because what you do is you walk back by them in the opposite direction of how you want them to go. Now, you've got a point of balance right here at the shoulder. And the big mistake that people make is they stand here and poke the butt. Don't do that. You're telling your animal to go forward and backward at the same time. What you want to do is step forward, quickly walk back by them. Now I only want one animal in the squeeze chute, so I stop here to stop the next one from going in. Do kind of a fast motion inside the flight zone in the opposite direction of where you want them to go. It works. The next time you handle cattle, I want you to try this. Now, all of these drawings are on my website, Grandin.com. They're also in my book, Temple Grandin's Guide to Working with Farm Animals. Pick that up online. Now, this particular facility has a solid side on the outer perimeter. That's really good because then when everybody parks the vehicles along there, the cattle don't see it. And I've got an open fence on the inner side. Now, when you have a facility that has an open fence, you've got to stay away from it, except when it's time to move your animals. Remember how I showed that bubble? Now imagine that bubble is like a force field, and that comes out of that fence. If you stand in that force field, you're going to start to see the cattle do this, and they're going to start pooping. You back up away, they calm down. Now how big that bubble is going to vary again, depending on the size of the flight zone. When I first started working with cattle, cattle were a lot wilder than they are now. We've had 20 years of temperament selection. My student, Bridget Voisonnet, did the first research on temperament, and animals that shake up a squeeze chute and struggle had lower weight gains than cattle that were calm. They were less fearful. So for the last 20 years, especially up more in the northern areas, people have been really selecting for temperament. And some of the cattle we got today, they're not as wild. And I didn't realize how much temperament had affected some of our cattle until our experiment station got a heifer just this year in 2017, which is 20 years later. I call her the time machine heifer. We've been selecting our Angus cattle at our experiment station to be calm. They got hair whorls way down here. High hair whorls tend to be more flighty. Ours have got them down here, super, super calm. Now, when this heifer, I call her the time machine heifer, I think they tried out some new semen, and when she was standing in line with the other cattle, it was obvious she had a bigger flight zone. I could stand like this close to the chute where they could see me with our regular cattle, but I had to back up, over 10 feet away for this one flighty heifer to calm down. And she was trying to bust out of the chute. It was obvious the difference in temperament. It was like she was a throwback back to some of the temperament we had before. You have calmer cattle, it's easier to work them with an open side. You got really wild cattle, inexperienced people, probably better to close the side up. Now, why is that animal rearing? It's rearing because the person is standing too close. What he needs to do is just back up. Another thing I want you to notice that the ear of that animal is pointed towards the person. Also, I caught you. You got an electric prod in your hand right there. I would never recommend banning electric prods, but they should never be a primary driving tool. Get it out of your hand. You should only use the electric prod when walking back by, maybe rubbing down their back, something like that, fails to work. You have an animal that absolutely refuses to go in the squeeze chute. You pick it up on one animal, use it, then put it away. Get it out of your hand. Now, one of the concerns that comes up is how long should I make my single file? I want to make the single file long enough so I can get some following behavior. In our ranch, I think the minimum length might be, 4 large cows, 5 large cows. You don't want to get it too long. I don't want 20 cows standing in line getting in trouble in it. Meat packing plants, I'm going to have to make a longer chute, but they move along at a faster rate. But I want to be able to use following behavior so that when I bring animals into the crowd pen, I can just keep them going so they don't have a chance to turn around. Now, if you're operating your squeeze chute, then you got to stand up real close, unless you got one real expensive one with controls off to the side, but most people don't have that. So try putting a piece of cardboard on the back half of the squeeze chute so they don't see you standing there. Real simple thing that you can try. And it's got to be something stiff, because if it flaps, not going to work. Okay, let's just look at some of the discussion here about solid sides versus open sides. And in my earlier writings, I always said make it all solid. And then I got the time machine heifer. And I realized that our cattle that we used to have used to be a whole lot wilder. That's where solid sides made a lot of sense. If you have an open side on a chute, you got to maintain a people-free zone around it. I've been in facilities where I could actually draw a line in the dirt. And if you stood inside the line, the cattle would be doing this. If I stepped back outside the line, they would stop. It's going to require more stockmanship skill. And it's going to work better with some of the calmer cattle. Now, I would always recommend blocking up the outer perimeters, especially if there's going to be any vehicles around. Wild cattle or less skilled people. Okay, let's look at laying out a tub system correctly. You want to lay out a tub so as the cattle come on around the bend, they're going back to where they come from. So you want to use that behavior of naturally going back to where they come from. Now where I've got the computer arrow right here, animal's nose is right at the entrance to the single file chute. That animal needs to see up their 2 body lengths. You have to lay facilities out correctly. You know, there's been a lot of discussion about tubs versus bud boxes. Both systems must be laid out correctly, or you're going to have things that are not going to work. Tubs work best when they're full half circles. All right, this shows the right way and the wrong way to lay out a tub. And if you bend it too sharply where the dotted line is, you bend it too sharply so that when that animal stands at that entrance, it doesn't see a place to go, it's not going to work. I call that dead-ending the entrance to the chute. Or if you're in Europe, it would be the race. It's the same thing. Things have to be laid out right. This shows a really simple tub system that you can set up with portable panels, solid on the outside, got rid of the catwalks, and instead you stand right here, and once you shut the gate there, the cattle just circle on around you. You can use a flag just to bring the cattle right on around you. You can make this one out of portable panels. Here's another little layout. It's only a quarter circle tub, but the cattle still are coming around the whole facility, coming back around. Solid on the outside, and you just work this from here. They'll come right on around you. Now let's say you got a facility that is laid out wrong. Sometimes you can fix it by simply working your cattle from the other side. And then as you bring them around from the other side, they may be able to see up the entrance. Okay, how about the bud box design? One of the advantages of this is simple and economical to construct. Set it up in portable panels, but it's going to require more skill to operate. It too has to be laid out correctly. I've got drawings in Temple Grandin's Guide to Working with Farm Animals, drawings in my Humane Handling book. If you take this chute, angle it off here in the wrong way, it's not going to work. So what you do is you bring the cattle in, then you stand here and have them circle around you and go up the chute. Now this system, you absolutely must not overload it. It's even more critical. What you put in here in the box got to fit in the lead up. And one thing you want to avoid in any system is not leaving a single left over, because single cattle often get really upset. They're the ones that hurt themselves and they hurt other people. Now in crowd pens of different types, I like to use a little flag. And the big mistake that people make with driving aids is they just get in there and they're just getting way too aggressive with it. You know, sometimes you have an animal turned around in a crowd pen, I can use the flag to turn it. Other places you might find you don't even need a driving aid. This just shows some curved chute systems, person working in a radius. In packing plants and slaughterhouses, I usually recommend making it solid. You got unskilled people, you got all kinds of cattle coming in there. Often solid's the best way to go with a slaughterhouse. So you have 2 design concepts here. I can go simple and economical, but it requires greater stockmanship skill. That'd be something like the bud box. Or I can go more expensive, but it's going to be easier for unskilled people to use. Now, where a bud box makes sense, if you're up in Nebraska and you're moving cattle constantly from pasture to pasture and you're moving portable facilities around, it's a lot easier to set up a bud box with the portable panels. You know, you're in a meat packing plant, I've got all kinds of cattle, I've got employee turnover, I'm definitely going to go with the tub system there. Okay, let's look at some basic behavior principles. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of non-slip flooring. Totally important. Totally important out in front of the squeeze chute. Single animal scales, unloading ramps. And one of the problems you've got with flooring, it wears out gradually. And it wears out gradually, you may not realize how worn out it's getting. And your animals are starting to fall down more often. Sudden jerky motion scares. Also, if you're using a hydraulic chute, there's an optimal pressure. The mistake that people make when the cattle struggles, let's just squeeze it tighter. Make sure your animal in the squeeze chute stands in a balanced position. Because if you throw it off balance, it's going to struggle. That can especially be a problem in squeeze chutes where just one side squeezes. And when I showed that piece of cardboard there on the back half of the squeeze chute, that's blocking vision of somebody real close to them. This is a really nice woven tire mat that works really well for in front of squeeze chutes and unloading docks. All right, let's see how good you are at observation. I want you to raise your hand if you notice that that animal was not looking at the sunbeam. Oh, we're doing terrible on this. Just terrible. I can't emphasize, if you're working with animals, the importance of observing. Observing, look, it's looking right at the sunbeam. Well, maybe I better patch the hole in the roof that's making a sunbeam, or change the time of day I work them. Now, when I first started back in the 70s and 80s, cattle handling was truly awful. It was 500%, 500% of the time, hitting the animal with electric prodders, just completely awful. Cattle handling is one of the things that's been improved. There's a lot of people now doing handling workshops. That did not exist in the 70s and 80s. A lot more interest in good cattle handling. The Beef Quality Assurance and the National Cattlemen's Beef Association are doing workshops on cattle handling. That's one of the bright spots in the industry. Well, one of my former students, Ruth Woolywody, went out and looked at cattle handling in big feed yards. And I was really pleased with these results. Electric prod score of 5%, that's good. It used to be 500%. Vocalization. Vocalization, when you catch animals in the squeeze chute, will tell you if you're hurting them. If you squeeze them up or you catch their head and they moo, you're hurting them. Obviously, if I brand them, they're going to moo. But you should be able to get them in the squeeze chute and get them caught without them mooing. If they moo when you catch them, you've got something you need to fix. 1.3% vocalization score, falling way under 1%. You have a slippery floor or you get cattle too excited, your falling score might go up to 10%. That's atrocious. You need to be fixing that. Or they're miscaught. Catch them here, you catch them around here. See, one of the advantages of measuring handling is then I can tell, am I getting worse or am I getting better? Now, what measurement does is it maintains a minimum standard of handling. There's a lot of stuff in stockmanship that can go beyond this. But if I'm running a big feed yard or a ranch, I got to make sure that people aren't doing something really bad that I wouldn't want shown on the internet. Because remember, you can't escape this. Everybody's got them. This is the original slide from our temperament research we did 20 years ago. And we basically found that cattle that went berserk in a squeeze chute, that'd be our 4s, they had lower weight gains. Also, there's exit speed scoring. How fast do they run out of squeeze chutes? And that's related to weight gain. Now that we have tamed cattle down, we're starting to get other temperament traits. See, temperament testing up until recently pretty much just measured fearfulness. But you've got some other traits seeking to explore. Some New Mexico State University research showed that some Angus cows are going to get out there and eat a lot of pasture, really get out there and go get that pasture. And then there's other Angus cattle on the same farm, same handling experiences, that lay around the water holes. That's genetic differences in a trait that Jack Panscap, neuroscientist, calls seek. And then you've got the cow that will get you, come after you when you try to work on her calf. That's not fear, that's anger. And an interesting new paper just came out that showed that the animal that tends to attack you, that trait is not related to the exit speed score. I want to just write on the board over here, and I hope we got enough chalk, Panscap kind of emotional traits. Panscap is a neuroscientist. You've got fear. That's what we're measuring with traditional temperament tests. Then he calls it rage, that's anger. That's going to be that cow that comes and gets you when you try to work on her calf. Then you've got separation distress. Separation distress. Take the cow away from the calf. That's a separate trait from fear. For example, one dog eats up your house when you leave it home alone. Another one's fine. They'd be high and low separation. Then you got seek. That's the urge to explore. So those go-getter cattle are going to be high on seek. And then he calls sex, lust. Then you have nurture. You know, some animals do a better job of licking the calf. See, these are separate traits. And then you have play. Then you've got play. And what you want to do is imagine these traits on a music mixing board. Imagine that the traits of fear, rage, separation distress, seek, lust, nurture, and play, there's 7 of them, are different volume controls on a music mixing board. And an animal gets born with it set at different settings. Experience then can also move it some. See, an animal is both nature and nurture. But I think it's interesting now that we have tamed down a lot of these domestic cattle that we can start to see some of these other traits. It isn't as simple as just high and low fear. Don't overselect for temperament. One of my students did some research and she found that some mamas will call the calf. Others don't when they get separated. That's probably the separation distress trait. And then we had a few terrible mothers out on this ranch where my student did the study that walked away and left their calf. I don't think I want to keep those cows. Well, what's interesting now, that we got some tamer cattle, is we're starting to see that there's some other temperament traits other than just fearfulness, running out of squeeze chutes and shaking squeeze chutes up. Now, the main point I want to get across in this slide is when you force animals to do stuff, forcefully handle them, forcefully restrain them, you're going to get a lot more stress and a lot more cortisol than if you train your animals to voluntarily cooperate. And there's been a lot of research now on getting heifers acclimated to handling. Ron Gill at Texas A&M has talked a lot about this. At least spend some time with your heifers, you know, calming them and taming them down. An animal's first experience with something new needs to be good. Okay, if your horse bashes his head on the horse trailer, first time he goes in it, he's going to be scared of horse trailers. The first time you introduce a four-wheeler, don't chase him with it. Make first experiences with new things at least neutral experiences. And acclimating animals can reduce stress. Now, there's quite a lot of research now, both old research and new research, that shows that good stockmanship pays. But the thing I have found is people want the thing, the fancy new facility, more than they want the management. When I first started in my career, I made the mistake of thinking I could solve all problems with the right equipment. I can only solve half the problems with equipment. The other half is management. Now, I have to have at least adequate facilities. Forklift pallets tied together with string, and that's not an adequate cattle handling facility. Do need to have something better than that. But cattle that are handled carefully have lower cortisol levels. You take young heifers, you walk them through the chute, and let's feed them when they come out of the chute. They get a good experience. Because there was research done with dairy cows where they were taking heifers before they freshened and putting them through the milking parlor, and they weren't feeding them. So the more flighty heifers didn't like that very much. So you can get an interaction there with temperament. So we got to make sure when we're working on acclimating cattle, we're not stressing them. And if you want to work on this, it's one trip through the chute in a day. That's it. Don't do more than that. Now, the thing about something new is new things are attractive when the animal can voluntarily approach. I will go put some expensive photography equipment out in the field, they'll all come up to it. They approach it. If I take something new and shove it in their face all of a sudden, that's scary. And it's going to be especially scary for the animal with the high fear temperament. It's sort of the one to run out of the squeeze chute really fast. Novelty is both interesting and scary. Now, animal memories are specific because they're not words. They're pictures. So Ronaldo Cook found in his research that you can get cattle where you got a really small flight zone when you feed them cubes from a truck, but that doesn't transfer over to the corrals. The corrals are a totally different place. And you habituate an animal to a blue and white umbrella, this is a horse, that doesn't go over to a tarp. Tarps, umbrellas look different. It's specific. Many times people have said, my animal was fine at home and he went crazy at the show. And the reason why he went crazy at the show is you got flags, bikes, and balloons there. And the best way to train your animal to tolerate bikes and balloons might be to decorate the pasture fence with flags and balloons. Let your animal approach it. I just talked to a student yesterday that a Brahmin heifer jumped into the stands when it was being shown, when it got scared. They had that's a more high-strung animal, had a really big reaction. If that had been an old Hereford, it might have just pulled away. It would have had less of a reaction. Now, a lot of people handle their cattle on horses. Now, a man on a horse and a man on the ground are two different things. So it's really important to get cattle trained to both the person on the horse and the person on the ground, so that when they leave the ranch where they're handled on horses, they're not meeting their first person on the ground as a surprise. Because what can happen there is your flight zone can go from this big to the length of this room. You see, it's a different picture. So before cattle leave the ranch, they need to learn how to go in and out of pens with a person on foot. And get rid of the dogs around the lead-up chutes, biting cattle where they can't get away. It teaches cattle to kick. Now, I've seen good dogs out in the field move cattle really nicely, but I hate dogs around the lead-up chute. Get them used to different vehicles, different people. Some of the animals that have the most problems when they go to town are the ones that lead to sheltered a life. Now, here's an experiment that was done with cats that I thought was super interesting. It was done over in Scotland at the veterinary school there, and they looked at whether or not a cat was going to bite and scratch the veterinarian. So they looked at outdoor cats versus indoor cats. Indoor cats were more likely to bite or scratch the veterinarian because they'd been exposed to less things. Outdoor cats had already seen a lot more new things. Now, you manage what you measure. We've got to make sure we don't let bad become normal, because you could slip back into bad cattle handling habits, just the way if we didn't keep monitoring speeding, we'd be slipping back into not watching our speed. So I'm a big fan of scoring, of handling. Here are the scores. This is the same thing as on the beef quality assurance. And you see, the problem you've got with slippery flooring is if I don't measure it, it can gradually get worse and I may not realize it. The amount of use of the electric prod may gradually increase, and you don't realize it. So I really like, measuring handling, because at least this maintains a base level of stockmanship. Yes, there's things you can learn in stockmanship to go way beyond this, but I've got to make sure that we're doing the basics. I can also look at things like summit cattle are harder to handle than others. And when I see a problem right now, when I'm at a fed beef plant, and there's a welfare issue, it's something I have to fix at the farm, like maybe lameness, or there's cattle that have never seen a man on foot, and then they're really dangerous to handle at the packing plant. In 1996, I collected baseline data for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and only 30% of the plants could shoot dead 95% of the cattle with a single shot. And the reason for that was broken equipment. That's management. Then in 1999, I was hired by McDonald's Corporation to implement measuring handling and measuring stunning. Boy, did that make a difference. A plant had to make 5 numbers, or maybe they'd be removed from the McDonald's approved supplier list. And it worked because they knew exactly what they had to do. Another thing I'm really pleased about is there were 75 plants on the McDonald's approved supplier list. Only 3 had to build something expensive. All the others fixed things. They fixed slippery floors. We changed lighting. We trained people. We removed distractions. It was amazing how you could fix some of these older facilities with simple changes. This uses the principle of HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. What are the really important things to measure? It's also directly observable. It's not a paperwork audit. Now, the trick was figuring out the right things to score. And we found that vocalization was really a good measure of problems with handling in the squeeze chute. You have a restraining device either at a meat packing plant or at a feed yard, and you've set the hydraulics too tight, and they move when you squeeze them, it's too tight, or it's got a sharp edge, or it's got some other thing to fix. Now, in writing guidelines, the trend today now is to use what's called an outcome-based guideline. See, I never said anything about how to design facilities. They had to achieve certain outcomes. Then you have some practices we don't allow, like chaining up a downer and drag it around, poke an animal in the rectum, poke an animal in the eye. Stuff like that's not allowed, beating them. And getting away from input standards where we tell you how to build things. There still are a few places where you have to use an input standard, such as ammonia levels in indoor facilities. Now, let's get on the farm. What are some of the things that we can measure? Lameness. Lameness in dairy cows got really high, up to about 25%, because people weren't measuring it. Then Nigel Cook at the University of Wisconsin started measuring it. They dropped it down to about 13%. Now, lameness is a really good critical control point because there's all different things I have listed on this slide might make cattle lame. Lameness is the outcome. No, I want to reduce the lameness. The veterinarians and the managers have got to fix all the stuff I got on this slide. You know, there's probably 7 or 8 different things to make cattle lame. And, okay, one issue that I'm getting more and more concerned about is really, really, really bad leg conformation. In the late 80s, the pig industry started selecting for rapid gain, big loins, and thin bat fat. And they ended up with collapsed ankles and really bad leg conformation issues. Some of this has started to happen in cattle. We got to stop it. Fortunately, the Angus Association has now got EPDs for leg conformation. This can make animals really lame. And if they're bulls, they're not going to work very well. There's a pig with a really hideous foot. I don't ever want to see that on cattle. And my student has found some already. Let's make sure we solve this problem before it gets as widespread as it did in the pig industry. Pig industry's been working on correcting it, but they still have some animals with really, really rotten feet. And this is genetics, pure genetics. Crooked claw, that's another defect. Okay, then you have some practices we just ban. Dragging downers, beating animals up. Now, one of the things you can argue about is when does tapping an animal with a paddle, for example, become beating it? And I've got a video called Proper Use of Livestock Driving Tools. And when a cardboard box starts to crush, yep, that's beating. You're still going to need a few input measurements, maybe on water or space in a pen. And that's my website, Grandin.com.